Okay, let's get started. We don't have much time, so I'll try to do just a quick recap of what we did last time, and a few more halachas. Laws of cooking on Shabbos. Yuda, we learned the laws of cooking on Shabbos. A couple of things that we didn't finish off last time with, just to quickly recap. We all know that if there's a pot cooking on the fire on Shabbos, so that is a biblical prohibition. That's considered cooking min ha-torah. Similarly, if you take the pot and you pour from the pot on top of something else, so that also is able to cook kadei klippa, it is able to penetrate a little bit of the object you're pouring upon. Should also it can cook into the object you're pouring upon. That's if you pour from something that was on the fire onto something else. What if you poured into a second cup, into a kli sheni? Into kli sheni, the second cup, so it doesn't have the same status as what was on the fire. It can cook in the same way. However, the Gemara says that there are some things that could cook in the second keli, but the Gemara says there are certain things we know for sure that do not cook there. What are they? They are spices, tavlin, and liquids. Liquids and spices don't cook in a utensil that you poured into. So you have something which is on the fire. You have a pot of soup, and you take the pot of soup and you pour it into a bowl. So in that bowl is a kli sheni, and so whatever is in that bowl is not able to cook most things. But specifically, we don't know which things those are. The Gemara says there are two things we know for sure that cannot cook, and they are spices and liquids. If you take that bowl and you pour from that bowl to something else, so that's called irui mikli sheni. It's pouring from the second vessel. That doesn't cook, and certainly when you pour it into the third vessel, if you pour from the second vessel to the third vessel, and then you pour something to the third vessel, a kli shlishi, the third vessel also is unable to cook. But there are exceptions to that rule. That's what I wanted to go over today. Some of the exceptions to things we learned last week. For example, there are some things, it says in the Sefer, Birchas HaShabbos, there are some things that we see cook in a kli shlishi. We see that there's a dramatic change in those items, even though it's in the third vessel, and it officially is unable to cook. We see that it does cook. For example, oatmeal. Oatmeal is something you could see that cooks in a kli shlishi. So therefore, according to the Birchas HaShabbos, you're not allowed to make oatmeal on Shabbos, even in a kli shlishi. It's number one. Number two, a raw egg. A raw egg, even though it's officially it's a kli shlishi, it's a third vessel, nevertheless it is able to cook even in a kli shlishi. And there it's not considered cooking. It is considered cooking. Bottom line is that since you see a dramatic change, you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. There are those who say that ketchup, since ketchup has gone through some cooking to become ketchup, you're allowed, even, we learned last time that if you have what's unique about the let's say the soup bowl in comparison to the pot which is on the fire, that the soup bowl, its walls, the walls of the soup bowl aren't hot because it was on top of the fire. Unlike the pot which was on the fire, the walls of the pot are hot, and therefore the soup bowl in general has different status. Most things cannot cook in the soup bowl. However, we said that if you have a solid substance, you have a piece of meat, since a piece of meat is not affected so much by the walls of the container that it's in, because a piece of meat is not touching all the walls of whatever it's put into. So therefore, if you have a piece of meat which is even in a kli shlishi, you can put it into a third utensil, it has a status according to some as a first utensil because it's not affected by the walls. But and even according to them, however, there are those who say they ought to put ketchup on a hot piece of meat according to some because the ketchup has already gone through cooking itself, and there is no bishul achar bishul. There's no cooking after cooking. Now, it's not so simple. Why is it not so simple? I know I said we'll do a very quick class, but there's so much information. If I feel like if I go quickly through it, not going to get anything. So let me slow down a little bit. Let's talk first of all about sugar and salt. The Alter makes a distinction between sugar and salt. Are you allowed to pour sugar and salt into your soup bowl? You have a pot of soup, you pour the soup into your bowl. Are you allowed to pour salt into it? So it would seem, we just said a second ago, that there are some items we know for sure that do not cook in a second utensil. What are they? Spices. Salt is a spice. So therefore, it would seem that's for sure 100% okay to pour salt into the soup. However, the Alter Rebbe says that we cannot do that. And the reason for that is because the Gemara makes a distinction specifically about salt and says that salt is like the meat of an ox, and there are different opinions in the Gemara. What exactly is the distinction of salt? Is it harder to cook or is it easier to cook? There are two opinions in Shulchan Aruch. And since there are two opinions, therefore the Alter Rebbe says that we should not pour salt into a second vessel. A third vessel is okay, Kashapp is okay. But a second vessel, if you pour directly from the soup bowl into your bowl, you should not put salt into it. The Munkach Rebbe, he had a custom that whenever he had soup, he would thank Hashem. Why? Because it says, Alter Rebbe says, if you're careful not to pour salt into your soup, you get a bracha. You get a machmer tavli bracha. If you're strict, you get a bracha. So you get a bracha from the Alter Rebbe. If you just pour the soup into if you pour the soup into a third vessel and then put the salt into it, a bracha from the Alter Rebbe. It's a small thing. In the Kli Shlishi. Pouring in the second vessel. Right, not to put in the second vessel, only put in the third vessel. So that's regards to
pepper also.
Pepper. Oh, pepper is a tavlin in general. Pepper is a spice, but the Alter mentions pepper, and peppers is not something so simple. We had a class a few months ago. If you remind me, I'll send you the class about pepper. Pepper is a big subject.
You said oats. Is that instant oats or regular oats? The difference
Kvaker, maza kvaker. The language of a forecast in the Sefer is kvaker. Kvaker is oatmeal, right?
Right. Which one? Is that not?
Well, let's go by the reasoning he said. The reason he said is because you could see a dramatic change in it. So that's all oatmeal, right? Mm-hmm. So okay. There's another thing which I mentioned last time, which has to be qualified. That is, if you have a kli shlishi, kli sheni, the second utensil, kli sheni. What did we say before? That a kli sheni, if you have the second vessel, it will not cook liquids, which would mean if you have a cup of coffee and you want to put in a cup of coffee milk, it should be fine. You shouldn't have to put the cup of coffee into a third vessel to pour the milk into it, because a kli sheni cannot cook a liquid. However, the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, let's say you have a hot mikveh. A hot mikveh, it's so much water, it's so hot. So if you pour something into it, even though the mikveh is considered like a kli sheni, but because there's so much water, because it's so hot, therefore you should not pour cold water into the mikveh, because even though it's a kli sheni, in a kli sheni you cannot cook a liquid, but the exception is when it's boiling hot. So how can you justify pouring milk into your coffee? You know your coffee is boiling hot. Otherwise, it's not really such a good coffee. But if you have a really good coffee, so then you shouldn't pour milk directly into the coffee. Better to pour into kli shlishi. Better to pour into the third cup, because although I just said before that a liquid does not cook in a kli sheni, but if it's very hot, it could cook in a kli sheni. And therefore, better to pour the coffee into the third cup and then pour the milk into it.
Why would it? The hot mikvah would never be more than Yatzalet, otherwise you wouldn't go inside.
Okay, so let's say it's early morning before anyone goes inside, and now it's very hot. So the question is, what's the halachic status of it? Question is what is, if it is very hot, what happens to be very hot, what's the halachic status? So one discusses and says that the halachic status of a hot mikveh is like a kli rishon in the sense you cannot pour liquid into it. One more thing, let's go. I have to really wrap up. Let's go to one more thing. Sugar. The Alter Rebbe doesn't say the same thing about sugar that he says about salt. Sugar, the Alter Rebbe says you should not pour from a kli rishon. You should not pour directly from the fire onto sugar, which sounds like you're allowed to pour sugar into a kli sheni. You don't buy salt, we said to put into kli shlishi. By sugar, the Alter just says, don't pour it from the pot which is on the fire, which sounds like if it's already in the second pot, it's okay to put sugar into it. Why is sugar different? So you might say that sugar is a spice, and spice is okay. So but let's go a little deeper into that for a second. The rule is, ein bishul achar bishul davar yavish, which means if you have something which is completely dry, it cannot be considered. It doesn't halachically, although it heats up very much, it doesn't have the status of something which is cooked. If as long as it's dry. So the question is, with sugar and salt, they're dry, but then they melt. So do we look at sugar and salt as something which is dry and therefore cannot cook in a kli sheni? Or do we look at sugar and salt as something which is a liquid because it turns into a liquid? How do we look at this? So the Alter Rebbe says that we have to be strict about sugar and salt. And we have to say that although they're dry, since they turn into a liquid, we have to consider them. I know it's Shmuel's thing. Shmuel's thing is, 1 second, it's a liquid. A liquid's mutter and a kli sheni. There's a difference between a liquid and a davar lach. There are things which are liquids, and then there are things which are moist. Things which are moist, and you're not allowed to put into a kli sheni. On the contrary, only something which is dry do we say that there's no cooking after cooking. If something is moist, there is cooking after cooking. So if you have sugar and you have salt, although it went through a process of sugar was cooked already, but now the salt was also cooked already. But there's difference between let's talk about sugar for right now. Regards to sugar, the Alter Rebbe says you're allowed to pour sugar into kli sheni. Why? Because although the sugar now has a status as something which is moist because it turns into a liquid, still and therefore it should be forbidden to be put into a kli sheni. Why should it be forbidden to put into kli sheni? Because there is cooking after cooking in something which is moist. Only something which is dry is no cooking after cooking. Still, you're allowed to pour the sugar into it. Why? Because sugar is considered like a spice. Regarding salt, the Gemara says that salt is considered something which is unusual, though it is a spice, and therefore it should be strict about salt. But regards to sugar, we have to consider sugar in a kli sheni as something which is moist, and therefore it could recook in a kli sheni. Just like on Shabbos, you could take a challah and put the challah on top of your soup pot, and the challah will become very, very hot because there's no baking after baking. Although it's cold now. But the halacha is it can never be considered forbidden to put the challah on top of your soup pot. Why? Because it gets boiling hot. The halacha says that once it's baked, it can never be baked again. What about you taking the same soup and pouring into a bowl and pouring noodles in the bowl, or pouring the soup on top of the noodles? The noodles are moist, let's say. If you have moist noodles. So what's halacha about the moist noodles?
It's wet.
It's wet. So regarding a liquid, what do we say? A liquid cannot recook in a kli sheni. This is a liquid. So regarding the liquid which is on top of the noodles, it can't recook because there's no cooking in a kli sheni for liquid. Regarding the noodles were cooked already. So there's no cooking after cooking for the noodles because the noodles were cooked already. There's no cooking after cooking for the moisture on the noodles because the moisture is a liquid, and a liquid can't be cooked in a kli sheni, and therefore you'll be allowed to put the noodles into your soup without it being a kli sheni. But what about soup nuts, or what about challah? Challah you can't put into your soup because you can't put challah in your soup. Why? Although there's no baking after baking, but there is cooking after baking. So the challah which wasn't baked, which was baked already, it's not forbidden to bake it again, so to speak, putting it on top of your soup pot. But there is a problem of putting the challah into your soup because that's cooking it. And there's halacha in a kli sheni. There's a problem of if it's hot and it's going to make the challah hot, we don't know which items are. The only things the Gemara says specifically that do not cook in a kli sheni are liquids and spices. Challah is not a spice. Challah is not a liquid. So challah could cook in a kli sheni. And therefore, you can't put challah in a kli sheni because the challah will cook. It was baked already. Doesn't matter. There could be cooking after baking. By this sugar, the sugar halachically is looked at as a spice. Therefore, the sugar could be put in a kli sheni. But the challah, because the challah is only baked, if you put the challah into the kli sheni, it's going to cook it. What if you have a brownie and you want to take the brownie and put the brownie comes out of the freezer. You want to take the brownie from the freezer and put on top of your soup pot so it should be easier to eat. It's a problem. Problem is, although the brownie is dry, but number one, the moisture from the freezer is going to heat up. Let's say, I'll take it off before it heats up. I'll take it off. I'll take the brownie from the freezer. I'll take the challah also. Challah from the freezer, which has moisture on it. You want to put the challah and put it up in the soup pot. So you want to heat it up. Is that okay? It's a problem. The problem is, although you may take it off before it heats up, halacha says you can't do it because you may forget. So you can't put something which has moisture on it from the freezer, the challah or the brownie on top of the soup pot, unless you put it in a place which it will never get boiling hot. If you know if it has moisture, we rely on what we see, the little icicles. The definition of moisture in halacha is if it's wet enough to make something else wet.
Are you talking here about moist from a freezer?
Yeah.
So is it something, it's frozen, right?
Yeah. So
you usually change its color, it's white.
The bottom line is, it doesn't matter how moist. The problem is it going to cook? Is it going to melt? Is it going to melt and become turn hot? If it's going to melt and it's going to become hot, it's a problem.
Right. So is this something that we can decide on our own, or it's just all challah from the freezer counts?
1 second. Regarding the soup nuts. Soup nuts, if they were deep fried, which most soup nuts, I think, most croutons, some croutons are deep fried. If they're deep croutons which are deep fried, so then there's no cooking after cooking. They may call it baking, but it's not halachically. It's deep fried. It's considered cooking, and therefore there's no cooking after cooking.
I think you have to wait. You have to let it do to be cooler. Then you have to put the croutons.
No
So
problem.
It shouldn't be boiling.
Oh.
He said, sorry, it shouldn't be boiling, but that's.
One second. Hold on. Even if the soup is boiling hot, there's no cooking after cooking. What's the problem? There's no cooking after cooking. The soup nuts were cooked already. What's wrong with putting the soup nuts into your soup if it's a cliché? There's no cooking after cooking. It was cooked already.
You shouldn't put milk in a boiling hot cliché. What the same thing applies.
The soup nuts were cooked. The milk wasn't cooked.
You're talking about soup that's in challah.
Right. No. Challah was baked, so there is cooking after baking. It's a problem. The soup nuts were cooked already, so they can't be cooked again. They're cooked.
Nuts are, when they're fried in oil, they're tefeach on maslat tefeach. If you touch the soup nuts and then you touch your hand, you're going to get oil on the second hand.
Soup nuts? I know how you make soup nuts.
Fried.
Check it out.
If you buy it from the store, it's just dry. It's dry soup nuts. What are you talking about? Right? Dry. They're dry. The ones you buy, the awesome ones are dry. They're deep fried, and since they're deep fried, there's no cooking after cooking, so they were cooked already. They can't cook again. Doesn't matter how hot it is. Can never cook. But you're saying 1 second. You're asking a question. If it's super hot, so why are we looking at it as a klisheni? Maybe we should look at it as a klisheni. And if it's a klisheni, you got me confused. So 1 second. If it was saying that so hot, it's boiling hot, and like Yushma was saying, you're saying a vart. You're saying why make a distinction between the the cup of coffee, which is boiling hot, I put the milk in, and the soup nuts putting in the coffee.
But when you said that there is an issue.
Who said? Who said?
You said you have to wait.
Who? What did I say? Yeah, what?
You have to wait till it's.
So wait till it's. What kind of crouton? Is it deep fried? Is it baked? What's the status? So, but I'm wondering. You're saying every time. You're saying if we're considering something just boiling hot, that's way beyond Yatzalezbe. That's a problem in the Sheni. We should be strict to begin with, and then you're right. You have a point. All right, let's stop here.
Rabbi, sugar, or whether you buy sugar from outside, that is cooked, it's processed.